So today we're doing, oops, don't want to open that. Today we are doing CodingBat, array2 evenOdd. So we want to return an array that contains the exact same numbers as the given array, but rearranged so that all the numbers or all the even numbers come before all the odd numbers. Other than that, the numbers can be in any order. So you can modify and return the given array, or you can make a new array. This is interesting. So essentially, the first thing that really comes to mind is to sort of understand that we have to have some distinction or some means by which we may be able to distinguish between even and odd numbers. I'm going to be taking this to IntelliJ so that we can have some more flexible working space, and then we'll discuss more about what I'm talking about. So let's go ahead, now that we're in IntelliJ here, let's go ahead and get the public static void main. And what you want to realize is that if we have, if we're making our own program, we actually have to copy the nums array that is assumed for us. We actually have to copy the nums array that is assumed for us. So this is all going to be a new array here. So that's just a shorthand way of how we can actually make an array. And the idea here is to get all the odds on one side and all the evens on the other. So my approach here was to make a for loop which populates a new array that I create from left to right. And in order to do this, you can see that I will actually need an array. So let's bring that into existence. The length of which I'll actually have to specify. So you'll notice that we are just rearranging the numbers. We're not exactly excluding any numbers at all. And so the length of this array can just be the length of nums, which is nums.length. And we actually have to use the keyword new as well. So let's go ahead and sort of do what I'm talking about. So we want to populate new array left to right with all the odd numbers. And so here in this case, let's shorten down our array so that it's simpler to work with. We have 4 elements in our array. And we essentially want to judge whether the first is even or odd. If it's odd, then we will essentially not populate the array starting from left to right. But if it's even, then we'll populate the array again, starting from left to right. So what I notice here is that, well, let's try to do this. So we have our new array at I. Oops. Well, actually, let's first judge whether or not the element is even or odd. So if nums of I, that is, of course, any given element on any given iteration, if nums of I modulo 2 is equal to 0, then we know that number is even. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, if you take a number and divide it by 2, if it's even, the remainder will be 0. If it's odd, then you'll get a whole number as a remainder. The modulus operator actually returns the remainder, so it's very convenient for us to leverage this fact and apply it to the context of our program. So if nums of I modulus 2 is equal to 0, then we're dealing with an even number. Otherwise, the number would be odd. In the case that it is an even number, Well, we would want to populate our new array with nums. So what could be the problem? There is a very important problem here, which I'm going to highlight by actually printing out the contents of new array. You'd expect after this for loop iterates that new array is only populated with even numbers. But on second thought, it's not. Actually, using zeros and ones in this case can be rather confusing. So let's go ahead and use other numbers, which can so you'll see here that, well, what has our program done exactly? On the first iteration, when int I equals 0, we're at the first index we're at the 0th index referencing the first element, and we check if that number is odd. Well, it's not, so we skip to the next. And this too is not odd, so we skip to the next. So nums of so essentially over here we haven't populated the first two elements of the new array. And so since they have a default of 0, they remain 0. Since this is even, we plug it in to our new array. You can see that new array and nums array are sort of working in unison with one another. That is to say that their indexes are the same each and every time we increment. That's something that we don't want to do. If new array has if we sense a even index in nums array, then we would want to place that as the first element in the new array. So having I as a common denominator to represent which element we're populating or which element we're on in the case of nums, this is probably not the right approach. It's better instead to recognize that instead of these two arrays, their counters, or rather their index, instead of them working in unison, we can have an integer variable called index and set that equal to 0. Here, index can equal 0, so that so suppose we are in the suppose we're iterating through the nums array, and we're here, which would be 0, 1, 2. So we're actually here, and this is referencing the third element, which is even. So in the case that it's even, it's not going to populate the third element of the array for new array. It's instead going to populate the first. It's going to store 6 into the 0th index, because that's where our index counter starts for new array. So new array of 0 will equal what is even. There's another problem here. Even doing this doesn't seem to solve our problem. Why? Because you can see that for the first iteration, 5 was equal to 5 is odd, and so we don't populate new array. For the second iteration, when we're on the first index, which references the second element, nums of I is still odd, hence we move on. Here it is even. So new array at index 0, that is of course the first element in the array, stores the number 6 in its first element. New array at index 0 is storing nums of I, which in this case is 6. The only way we got here was because 6 is even, and it passed this Boolean condition. So why isn't this 6? Well, it's not 6 because we haven't finished iterating yet. As we move on, nums of I is 3. And of course, 3 is odd, and so we don't enter this if statement at all. We come to the last last element. And since it's even, we enter in again. New array sub-index, index being 0, references the first element referenced by the 0th index in the new array. And we store the number 8. Hence, index, this entire program is just storing an even number at the first element of new array. It's not keeping track of where we are in the new array. And so we want to increment index by 1 each time we enter, so that we can store a new even number at a different index. Now you can see that throughout the entire array, we've gotten the even numbers, which are 6 and 8, namely, in the first positions. Moving forward, we want to populate the rest with all the odd numbers. Let's make another for loop to do that. In here, we actually want to judge. We want to reiterate through the for loop and judge if nums of I modulo 2 is not equal to 0. We know that if nums of I modulo 2 is equal to 0, then the number is even. But if nums of I modulo 2 is not equal to 0, then the number would be odd. Hence, in this case, we can begin populating from where we left off. So, since we've stored all of the even numbers to the very beginning of the array, now we would want to populate the rest. We would want to start populating where our index for new array left off, which would be at this element, or which would be at this position. You see, as we were moving through this particular for loop, we incremented index one last time before the for loop ended, so that the next time we come back, we're referencing a new element. So here, we're actually at this, this particular element here. So now we can start populating from here. So if I say, if it's not equal to 0, the new array at index, which would of course be, in this case, 0, 1, 2, it would start at 2, will be equal to nums of I. It would continue doing so until the length of the array ended, which of course is the same length of new array, the array that we're most concerned about. We would like to increment index one more so that we can keep track of where we are in the new array. You'll see now that we've successfully taken all the even numbers and put them to the very right of the array, or left rather, and all the odd numbers to the very right. If I were to print this out in a horizontal manner instead of a vertical, you'd see that all the even numbers are to the left and all the odd numbers are to the right. Let's actually test this out. In CodingBat. Let's go ahead and return new array. This was a good way to do this question. However, when we're using two for loops, always ask yourself if we can get away with it just by using one. What's the goal here? Well, if we have an array and it has 4 elements, some are even, some are odd. Of course, each of these elements have their own index. We would want to create another array and this would be our new array. Once it's created and once we state the length of the array, this array then has a bunch of zeros. So what would we do? Well, we would have to start off by creating a new array, the length of the original array. We would use a for loop. Now, what I want to do here is, if we, let's see here. So essentially, if it's even, then I'll start populating starting from the right. But if it's odd, then I'll start populating starting from the left. As I do that, I should eventually reach a point where I have all my numbers in proper format. How do we do this? Well, if you think about it, we would want one index to start populating from the left, or from the left, and we would want another index which starts populating from the right. In the case that it's even, the index which is taking responsibility for the even numbers, it'll start going from the left. And if it's odd, then it's going to start going from the right. So we're going to have int even index. It's going to start from the left, so from 0. And int odd index is going to start from nums.length minus 1. If the number is essentially even, then the new array will start from the even index, which is of course to say from the right or from the left. It will populate in that manner. But of course, if nums of I modulo 2 does not equal to 0, then we will instead have new array go from the odd index, which is to populate from the left. Now, we want to be able to keep track of each index. So we would want to increment even index such that the next time we come back here, we're starting from a new index, or of course, populating a new element or a new position. The same thing here, but recall that we're not actually populating, moving from the left to right, we're instead moving from the right to left. So we would decrement new array instead of incrementing, or rather the odd index. So let's go ahead and take this to IntelliJ and try to make this a reality here. So we're going to have int even index, which is equal to 0, int odd index, which is equal to 0, or which is equal to nums.length minus 1, since we're moving from the back. We're going to have a for loop, which is going to start from 0, and I should be less than nums.length minus 1. We'll increment I by 1. If nums of I is, of course, even, then new array will start populating from the even index. Otherwise, if nums of I is equal, if nums of I modulus 2 does not equal to 0, in the case that it's odd, then new array at the odd index will start populating from the odd index. To keep track of where the index is, we actually want to decrement or increment respectively. Now we can return new array and see if we have a favorable outcome. All the even numbers are on the very right, and all the odd numbers are on the very left. But I think we're talking about a different program. I think I have to run this one here. It seems like we're getting 0. Even index equals nums of I. Odd index, nums of I, decrement the odd index. Well, let's see here. So for the first one, if nums of I modulus 2, if it's even, then we'll store it at 0. It's not, so we store it to the left. Second one, we store it to the left. Even, we store it to the right. Odd, we store it to the left. Let's see here. So I took a look at Python tutor here, which is a code visualizer. And I noticed that despite whatever I do, my middle element is not being stored. And I think this is because this for loop says only iterate for nums.length minus 1. And it's never registering my last element. So I have to go back and change that. There's no reason that should be nums.length minus 1. We're incrementing the individual indexes in this case, or decrementing, but we are in no means referencing an index outside the bounds of the array. So now you can see that all the even numbers are on one side and all the odd numbers are on the other side. So if I take this code here and let's see. And if I take it to CodingBat, you'll see that I get all greens.